Well, hey, thanks everybody for coming out. I'm super excited to be here. The greatest thing here is last year I was sitting in your seat. And so a year ago I decided, you know what, I'm gonna see what I can do to come out to ng-conf and speak. And I worked my tail off to do so. And now today I get to speak actually 3 times here. So it's a huge honor to be here. And really looking forward to walking you guys through Ngrx complex forms, otherwise known as Serenity Now. Just handle complex forms with Ngrx, otherwise known as don't cry, it's going to be okay. So forms are hard. When we start building applications, forms usually start out fairly easy. You know, the specs I get in aren't too bad. I can go ahead and start to create a form and you know, put some validators and some conditional logic in there. And then before I know it, usually we start getting a little deeper into the application and things get a lot more complex. So what comes to mind when I think of complex forms is a project I worked on a couple of years ago. And that project, when we go to create a new form, we'd actually have to ask the database, what kind of form is it? And then they would send us a spec down about what the form is, what are all the fields, and they were really named nicely. So A16, you know, A52, so it was all this numeric stuff. And then it had the rules on when to display things and how to validate it. So really complex forms. Now, I'd love to teach you all about that, but that's even going to such an extreme. It'd take really a workshop to get you guys through that. So today what I want to do is talk to you about how do we simplify forms? How do we make our lives easy? So it really starts with Ngrx. Ngrx is about simplifying our lives and getting ourselves to a level of serenity, making things easy and repeatable, having a dependable way of handling logic. Because the alternative is this, and a lot of us do this, is we'll create some sort of service. Usually I call mine session service, and it starts out fairly innocent. It's got, maybe 50 lines of code in it. And then a year later, it's got over 600 lines, and that is the one module. It has this header in it that says, do not touch. Right? Because when I touch this, everything breaks in production when it goes up, and it's really hard to find, and lots of problems. So Ngrx is all about creating some serenity in our lives, creating a dependable way on how we're going to do things. The other thing that I'm going to hammer on you guys today is container presentation. Who's doing container presentation now? Otherwise known as smart components, dumb components. Okay? So a pretty good number of you. So this is a base concept that I really want you to take home and start using. Whether or not you start implementing Ngrx right now, container presentation is going to change how you develop your applications and is going to help you maximize the reusability. So when we look up here, we've got a container, we got a presentation. The container is responsible for how things work. That's its primary concern. It's the one that's going to interact with the store. It's going to dispatch events, and it's going to get selectors to get the data back out. It's going to then store those in observable variables, and then it's going to handle any sort of events that are being bubbled back up. The presentation component is responsible for presenting the data. How do things look? But it actually doesn't know anything. So if you look here, the difference on its input here, it's getting just plain old data. So it's not dealing with observables. It doesn't understand what an observable is. And then any sort of click events, whether I click on a product, I click on a customer, I want to save something, you know, whatever it is, the presentation component says, hey, I don't really know what you want to do here, but I'm going to go ahead and emit event out and allow the container to decide how it's going to be handled. By doing this, what happens is we maximize the reusability of this component. This presentation component, I can send it any sort of data. And then depending on what container it's wired up with, it can respond differently from page to page to page. How many of us have components where we pull in this beautiful session service or some other service and we say, hey, if this variable is set this way, then have it respond like this, otherwise have it respond like that, or save it like this. We end up creating this huge mess. So imagine if we could create container components that would help encapsulate this and help abstract this out so we could reuse these presentation components over and over and over again. The other concept I want to talk to you about is Ngrx entity. So this is part of the Ngrx library. It was released this past October, and I spoke on this at Angular at a conference back in October. So the idea of an Ngrx entity is that, and this really comes from the Redux spec, is how to normalize data. How do we deal with complicated data and relational data? So one of the tempting things to do is start to merge those together and nest that data. We do not want to do that. So instead, the idea is that our data comes usually to us, that's not gonna, no laser pointer. So the top one there with the ID, name, foo, so we've got array-based data, right? That's how it's coming from our APIs. That's typically, we're making a call, I'm getting some data, and that's typically what we're working with. But the problem with this is when we're dealing with relational data, it's very difficult then to find the customer with an ID of 12. I mean, I can iterate over it and I can find it and that's great. And that works great for one. But what if I have 1,000 records I need to match up? Now I have a performance issue. So the spec on normalizing data is to actually store it in a dictionary. So the Ngrx entity library makes it really easy for us to create entities that are stored as dictionaries. So my ID is my key and my value is my object. Now if I want a customer with an ID of 12, I just say customers, square bracket, 12. I've got my customer. Makes it very easy to go ahead and start joining this relational database or data back up. So you can see there, customer, customers, whatnot. All right, so today we're going to talk about some relational data. And I want to give you an example that we'd all be able to relate to, something really simple. So an order. An order has a customer that can be associated to it. And then an order has line items. And each line item then has a product. And the line item has a quantity, the product has a price. So pretty simple example. I think most of us have seen an order at some point in some old database. I remember it was the old Microsoft Access database that always had orders in it, you know, for all the sample data. So nested data, the really tempting thing to do here is to start to say, well, you know, I've got a customer. Why don't I just go ahead and embed that into my order? And I'll go ahead and embed my line items in and in the products and whatnot. So this is a very dangerous pattern to follow, because what happens when I go ahead and update the product, I have to find all the different places that I've inserted product and attached it to something else. So now I no longer have one-line reducers. I have these really complicated reducers that are 50 lines of code. They're very difficult to test. And the one thing that may not jump out to you that's going to be an issue is, because of the component architecture and because this data is immutable, if I go to update the product price, what happens is it's going to force every component above it, all the way up to order, to re-render. Because I'm going to be replacing the existing state with a new state, and thus it's going to force it to re-render. So that's a really bad thing that we want to avoid. So again, don't do this bad thing. What we really want to do is we want to take our orders, customers, products, and line items and move those all up to be first-class citizens within our store. That way we can use our entity library to be able to select and move stuff around, match it up. All right, so viewing complex data. So let's talk about a really simple example here. I want to be able to display a list of orders with the customer information and in a total. So this isn't too bad, right? So the first pass at this, it's like, okay, this is going to be easy. I'm going to enumerate over the orders. I'm going to select the customer and then the line item and select the product. And I'm going to do my calculations and everything's going to be great, right? Not so much. So selectors don't take parameters. So I'm not able to just make a simple enumeration over it and try to do this in the HTML and bring this together. Also, the other thing that started to come up is like, oh no, like I've got 4 different streams of data coming in, and now I need to figure out how I'm going to get those all back together so I can start to do these calculations. So the first thing that we did on our second pass is, all right, let's use combine latest. This will allow us to bring these 4 streams together, and we'll enumerate over it. We created a new order view class, or interface, if you will, and it has a customer on it, so I could attach a customer. And it has a line items array. I could go ahead and put those in there, and I could then attach the products to the line items. Fantastic, right? Except for now what I had is I had a container that has all this logic enumerating over it, and then I have a presentation component that has to enumerate over it. And so I'm really duplicating this calculation logic twice. So what we settled on is we do want to get it down to a single stream, use our combined stream. We want to do our calculations right at that moment. So now we're going to go ahead and just create a very simple order view model that has the 3 fields that I want, an order ID, a customer, and a total. And as I'm looping over these and finding them, which is I was already doing before, I can then go ahead and do those calculations, attach it directly, and then pass it down to my presentation component, and it can immediately render it. Nice and simple. So we have serenity, right? Everything's great, everything's grand. But the problem with that is that that's really not life. We do display data, but the harder part here is how do I actually edit data? So let's talk about form basics. This is a core concept that I want you to understand. So when we talk about our container, it's going to pass our data down through an input down to our presentation component. Our presentation component is going to create a form group. And now that form group, when we receive the values down, we're going to patch the values of our customer, our product, our order into the form group. And that's going to populate our form. And then when any sort of value changes, we want to output those back up and emit an event. And in most cases, what we want to do is we want to store it in a local variable. So we're going to have two variables on our container. One is going to be the observable for my type. So let's say we're dealing with orders. So I'm going to have an observable order, and then I'm going to have just a regular plain old order. And that's going to be my local variable, and that's what I'm going to hold changes in. Now, you may decide to do it slightly different. You might want to update the store right away with that data, and you have that option. But by doing it this way, when I click Save, then I can go ahead and update the store. I can go save my data, versus if I hit Cancel, now I have a store that's already updated with a whole bunch of data that I got to figure out how to roll it back. So just want you to understand the basics here about inputs and outputs and making sure that how you're wiring this stuff up. So let's take a look at a product form. This is a really simple example. We have two fields here. We have a product name and a product price. So nothing too complicated. Now on the container init, what we talked about what containers' responsibilities are, the container is responsible for loading data, dispatching to the store, and then doing selectors to grab that data. So on our init here, we're going to go ahead and dispatch our load product, and we're going to be giving it our customer ID. So we may give it an ID, we may not. We may be loading, actually that should be product ID. That's a little typo. So we'd be giving it the product ID there, and then we're going to have our product $sign. I like to go ahead and suffix all of my observables with a $sign so I can keep track between the non-observable versus the plain object. And I'm going to use store pipe to go ahead and select from my store and get my selected product. So now I have my data at my container level. The other thing I need to do with my container is I need to watch for changes. So on my product change, when that event's being emitted from my presentation component, I want to go ahead and get that product, and I want to set it to my local variable again. So it's not suffixed there with the $sign. Get my cursor over the middle of that. So I'm setting my local variable with that product that's been emitted back up. So that's how I'm getting my changes. Then the presentation component, if we take a look at it, it's really simple here. We have a couple basic things that we need to do. Obviously, it's got HTML, and its main job here is to render this HTML and render out the product and make it look visually nice, and then handle those events and pass them back up. So you can see here I have an input, and I've got my product coming in, and then I have an output for product change. And I'm going to go ahead and have an event emitter of type product, and now that's how I'm going to get the product changes back up. I'm going to create a private local variable called alive so I can kill my subscription to my observable. We'll see here in a second. And the first thing I'm going to do on my constructor is I'm going to go ahead and build a form. So there's really two parts to building the form. The first part here is pretty standard. I'm going to use my form builder, and I'm going to create a group, and I'm going to create two different properties, one name, one price, both with a required validator, and then one with a validate currency validator. So pretty simple. The second part is the part that's a little different. So here's where I want to capture changes that the user's making. And I don't want to capture every change, but I want to capture changes and get those sent back up to the parent so when they hit save, I can do something with that. So I'm going to use value changes. So when the value changes, I'm going to take values while we're still alive. So when we actually deconstruct this component and destroy it, alive is going to get set to false, and that'll go ahead and kill this subscription. We're going to skip the first one, and then we're going to debounce on 500 milliseconds. So I don't want to get every keystroke that the user's doing, but I do want to get it once the user stopped typing. And then from there, it's really, this is kind of a how you want to handle it. But in my case here, for this example, I basically want to say, hey, if the group's valid, then we'll go ahead and emit a value. Otherwise, just throw it away. Don't worry about it. We're just going to keep those values local. Your prescription on how you may want to do this might look differently. You have a lot of options here on when you send that data up. So the other important piece here is on ng on changes. So this happens when the input that we're passing down changes. So when we create the form group, if you notice back here, our default values are blank. They're just blank strings. So that we're not creating it with any values. So when the data actually does come in and we have loaded the product, now it's going to go ahead and patch those values onto the form. So we're going to watch for the changes. We're going to make sure the changes include product and it has a current value. And if that is the case, then we're going to go ahead and patch those values directly onto the form group, and our form's going to be populated. So again, going back to form basics, what I just showed you there is the container is going to dispatch to go do the load. It's going to select the data, and it's going to pass it down to the presentation component via its input. The presentation component is going to create a form group. On changes of that input coming down, it's going to go ahead and patch those values onto the form group. And then when any sort of value changes, we're going to watch value changes on the form, and when those happen and we're valid, we're going to output those through an emit event and set our local variable. So it's a very simple pattern. And this really is Serenity. This is as easy as it gets for a very simple form. There's not a whole lot of magic here. So this is great, but this isn't a complex form. But what I want you to understand are the form basics so that when you go to wire this into a more complex form, you understand how you might do this. So this looks more like what complex forms are like. A little more crazy. Usually we've got nested data, and this is where we're going to come back and look at our order form. So our order form here has a customer. It has line items, and in each line item has a product that I can set, and I've got a value on that. So if we come over here really quick, you can go ahead and see, here's our form. I can edit, and I can change my product to whatever I want. I can set my quantity. I can go ahead and change that. It updates my price, and it updates my subtotal. So I have a whole bunch of different components here. I've got my order summary. I've got my line items. I have a list of products. I've got my customer, which is an autocomplete. I can change this to Homer Simpson. So I've got a lot of things going on here, multiple levels. Oh, let's switch back over to slides. Here we go. So now what? How do I handle this? Because now I've got to deal with 4 different data sources and getting those passed in. So should we come back to this? So the first thing we're going to do is on our order container, we're going to go ahead and dispatch events. We're going to go out, we're going to load our order, we're going to get a list of customers, and we're going to then go select the one customer that's already attached to this order. We're going to go load our line items by the order ID, and we're also going to get a list of products so we can bind those to our selects. And then we're going to pass all of those down via inputs down to our presentation component. So coming back over here, then I'm going to go ahead and create a form group for this form, but it's really going to only have a couple of properties on it. One is for the customer, so the customer is required, and then one for line items, because line items are required. I have to have at least one line item for this to be valid. So just out of curiosity, this is saying I'm done in a minute. This is supposed to be an hour-long talk, right? Hour-long, okay. So I'm not sure what's going to happen there when... All right, it's going to shock me, you said, though? Okay, perfect. Excellent. So, all right, here. With this, so we've got our order form. We're going to create our form group for that, and then we're going to create a form group for each one of the line items. Who's ever done a form group array type? Anyone work with those? Fantastic. So it's a little more complicated. So each one of these lines here is its own form group, and then those are getting put into an array of form groups. And in that way, each one of those can be validated individually, and then we can add validators to that and assign it directly to that line item. So a little bit more complicated. So let's take a look at how we implemented this. First thing we did is we go ahead and build our form. And like I said, we're doing a form builder array. And then we're going to watch for changes on that. And again, we're going to debounce on 500. And if the form group's valid, if it's not valid, then we're going to return. Otherwise, we're going to emit the value back out. It gets a little bit more complicated on the line items build form group. So here, what we're doing is we're looping over the line items, and then we're adding a line item group. And then really the bottom function there is the one that's creating each one of the form groups. And those get added and pushed onto the line items form array. So we've got our product ID, which is required. We've got our quantity, which is required. And so we can build that. One of the other foundation concepts here is cloning is good. So usually we don't want to do a whole lot of cloning, but when we're building forms like this, and especially complex forms, this data is coming directly out of the store, and if we allow the user to go ahead and change it, we're mutating our data. So we now have a problem. So often what we're doing is when we're doing our selectors, we're going to go ahead and subscribe to that and then clone the data so that we're not actually having the user edit the real version of it. So why is this a big deal? Why should you even be concerned with this? We're going to look at some code here in just a second and start digging into the actual code for this. But what's the big deal? So the big deal here is that by doing it this way and building containers and presentation components, I can really tame the complexity of what's going on with my forms. I can go ahead and use my form groups to manage my data, to watch for changes, and then be able to pass that back up to my container and decide how I'm going to handle that later. So if we come over here and take a look at a little bit of code, here are the components. Is that big enough? Can you guys see that? Yeah, let's go one bigger there. So here's our orders components, and here's our orders container. Our container here is pretty simple. Basically, we have our order form in there, and then we're passing, you can see we're passing the orders async, customers async. If we actually break those out a little bit more so you can see them, we're passing all these down as inputs. For customers, line items, and products. And then I have my two different events coming back up for my changes on my order change and my line item change. And then here I've got my two different buttons for either save or cancel. So my HTML is pretty standard. During my ng-init, this is where I'm going to go ahead and get my order ID off the router. I'm going to go ahead and take that and dispatch a load order using that ID. And then I'm going to go ahead and select the order, and I'm going to clone it. From there, I'm loading my customers. I'm selecting. I'm dispatching for load line items, and then selecting those as well, so on and so forth. I have my two different change events here. So these are the ones that are coming back from my presentation component, coming back up. And I can go ahead and capture those and set those to my private variables, my line items private variable and my order private variable. And then on my save, I can go ahead and upsert each one of the line items and then go ahead and update my order. I'm going to take all the, so in this save here, we're actually doing a very simple save. So the save is actually going to go save the line items first, a separate API call. And then the second call is going to take the line item IDs and then put those onto the line item IDs on the order and then go ahead and upsert the order. Great. So not a whole lot of magic in the container. It's the same exact basic principles of what we looked at with the product form. Very simple in terms of we're going to dispatch, we're going to select, and then we're going to watch for those changes and then handle those appropriately when the users click save. All right, so on the components itself, though, this is where we've broken everything out. And so we have a lot of components. So this is a fairly complex form. We've got our order form here, which has a customer object or customer component, a line items table component, and an order summary component. And again, we're just taking that data that we're getting. It's already been processed through the async pipe, so we're just dealing with raw data here, and we're passing it down to each one of these components. So if we take a look at like the customer component, it's just using the material design autocomplete here, and then most of the code here for it is really just on the input. I'm going to get an input for what the current customer is, and I'm going to get an input for what all customers. We wouldn't really do this in a production app, right? We wouldn't load all customers and pass that down. We'd actually have it go back out to the server and load more data, and we'd have it dispatch out. So in this case, actually, we'd have another container that would hold this component, that would have that logic in it so that we could rewire it up and have it work differently for something else if we needed it to. But then again, the same basic things. We're going to build a form. We're going to watch for changes, and we're going to patch those in we're actually going to use set values. So we're using a banana box and doing two-way binding on this one. And the rest of this here is just for display of that component. The line items table has a little bit more code in it. This is laying out all the different products and setting the selectors and whatnot. But again, the basics, and this is what we looked at earlier in the slides, we're going to get our line items coming down to us as an array on our input, and we're also going to get our products coming down to us. And again, we're going to output any sort of changes that are occurring to those line items. When we come into our constructor, we're going to go ahead and build our form. We're going to patch those values onto the line items form array. So again, that works a little bit different since we have an array of those, and we're going to build a form group for each one of those line items. Okay, how are we doing on time here? 12:27. Excellent. All right. Let's switch back over here. All right, so what I hope you get from this is that NGRX is here to make your life simple. NGRX is here to help you reduce the complexity of your forms. If you start to understand the form basics and using container and presentation components to be able to maximize reuse and minimize having to custom code each one of your components and how they're going to deal with data, having the container or the presentation components create form groups, watch for those changes and emit those back out so we can store those back into a local variable. So we looked at some code there, great. So in summary here, create models to combine your entities. So anytime we're doing any sort of views, instead of trying to build those on the fly and have logic in both your container and your presentation component, you want to go ahead and take those and have them do all that logic in your container. Go ahead and build up your model and then pass that down as data on your input down to your presentation component. Really understand the container presentation pattern, again known also as smart components and dumb components. But if you start doing this, you're really going to maximize your code, reduce complexity, and maximize your reuse. So understand the NGRX form basics. So we've covered this multiple times about how to passing down on inputs, pass out changes on outputs, store in local variables, patch the values onto the form. And bottom line here that I want you to get out of this is NGRX will make your complex forms very easy. You're no longer going to have to deal with hopefully anybody get that error where it says value change since last checked? Yeah, right, that was a really fun one. I love that one, it's my favorite. It's very difficult to debug and very difficult to understand. And it's mostly just caused because we're constantly pushing stuff back onto changes that are getting reprocessed and causing this kind of infinite loop for Angular. So really quick, Brebug, what we do is we do architecture reviews, we do customized training, and we do Angular consulting. If you found this presentation useful and you want to learn a little bit more, please come out. We've got a booth actually right outside the doors here. Be happy to take questions there. And you can reach me via either Twitter at @JesseS_Brebug, or you can reach me at jesse.sanders@brebug.com. So thanks everybody for coming.